should say the reason that I was kind of organizing chapel today was that Brock's home, his wife, and I think one child at least, 2 children are sick. And so he's taking care of them today and not able to be on campus. So we want to keep him and his family in our thoughts and prayers as well. All right, you've got before you copies of this exchange of letters that the Hebrew congregation, it's an open letter that was read before Washington when he visited Newport, Rhode Island on August 17, 1790. And then his reply that he sent after he returned to New York a few days later. Other than the strange 18th century capitalization that's already been mentioned, you'll notice, and it's not, I don't think it's a code to a hidden treasure underneath the Washington Monument, but Travis thinks it is, and so if you want to go try to figure that out, I'll have to have a finder's fee or something, okay, for providing the letters themselves. But background as far as these letters go, we need to understand kind of the situation as it existed in Rhode Island. There was an independent, kind of religious independent streak as far as Rhode Island was concerned, all the way back into the 17th century. You had obviously Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson, and consistent with that kind of independent religious kind of notion in Rhode Island, the state charter of 1663 was the first in North America to provide for religious liberty as far as its organic law was concerned. It was embedded in the charter itself. And that charter remained in effect until the state constitution of 1842. And I want you to listen to what the state charter said about religious liberty. It said, "No person within the said colony at any time hereafter shall be anywise molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any differences in opinion in matters of religion. All and every person and persons may, at all times hereafter, freely and fully have and enjoy his and their own judgments and consciences in matters of religious concernments throughout the tract of land hereafter mentioned. They behaving themselves peaceably and quietly, and not using this liberty to licentiousness and profaneness, nor to the civil injury or outward disturbance of any others." And so when you think about Rhode Island, you think religious liberty, not religious tolerance, but religious liberty. And so when we think about the Jewish community that existed in Newport, on paper at least, 17th century Jews in Newport had many more religious liberties than would have existed in the surrounding colonies for Jews, although they certainly continued to face political discrimination and discrimination of other types. But on paper, they had many more religious liberties than others around them. Now, the Jewish community in Newport grew, and it was made up mostly of Sephardic Jews, and Sephardic Jews are of Spanish and Portuguese descent, Middle Eastern descent, and so most of these came from Spain and Portugal. And they began to grow and to thrive as a community. In 1756, a synagogue was organized, and this community reached its peak in the 1770s. Now, the Revolution, the American Revolution, took its toll on this congregation of 200 men, women, and children. Isaac Turo, he was the Hazan, or the prayer leader of the synagogue at the time, and others supported the British. And so what happened is that there was kind of a rising tension between those who supported revolution, those who supported remain loyal to the crown. And what happened was this caused many to consider the Jews as a group, traitors to the colonial cause. And the British invaded Newport, and the occupation of Newport caused Jews to want to escape. There was a lot of fighting, a lot of death, a lot of destruction. And so they fled from Newport, and most of them never returned. The community remained there, although smaller than it had been at its peak, at its largest. And the interesting thing is, after the Revolution, it becomes this kind of center for probably what's the most important exchange of letters in American Jewish history, and certainly an important exchange of letters in regard to American religion in general and American history as a whole. And so let's look at those letters and think about them as we set the context. Now, as I mentioned, Washington came to Newport in August of 1790. This is right after Rhode Island had ratified the U.S. Constitution. And so what Washington was doing is he was visiting all these states after they ratified the Constitution. He comes to Newport. And there were many open letters that were read to Washington when he visited this city. And one of them was this letter that you have before you, written from the Hebrew congregation to Washington. And it was read by the prayer leader of the Hazan at the time. And his name was Moses Satius, is how you pronounce that last name. And so he reads this open letter, and if you'll look at it, we won't spend a lot of time on their letter to Washington, but if you'll notice, it's filled with biblical imagery. You have the idea of the God of Israel protecting Washington from the days of difficulty. At the very beginning, they describe themselves as the children of the stock of Abraham. You have them referencing David being delivered from peril of the sword. You have the idea of Daniel being blessed to preside over the provinces of Babylon. And they're comparing that to what is happening to Washington as he is now President of the United States under this new Constitution. And they praise this new Constitution. They praise this new government. They talk about that it's a new government where liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship are available to everyone. They talk about that there are blessings of civil and religious liberty that they're now able to enjoy. And obviously, the implication is that they did not enjoy those before the Constitution. And so they're praising him, they're thanking him, they're praising this new government for the establishment of religious liberty and liberty of conscience. Now, after his return to Washington, or New York, excuse me, getting ahead of myself, Washington replied, and what he does is he reassures the Jewish community regarding religious liberty. He agrees with them. And I want you to notice three things that he does in this letter. Let's begin here in the fourth paragraph that begins, "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship." And so what he says is that the guarantee of freedoms that the Constitution was providing broadly, he says, you're right, they do apply to you, the Jews of the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. The second thing that he does is he says that religious liberty is not religious tolerance. He says it's a natural right, and so he follows Jefferson in this idea. The idea is not that governments grant you the right and tolerate your religion, as maybe existed in Great Britain, maybe existed at the time in Europe, but rather it's a natural right given to you by God. And so he says, it is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Now he quotes their own letter here when he says that the government of the United States does not gives bigotry no sanction, persecution no assistance, and that kind of thing. And if you'll look back at the letter, it's a quote of their letter. And so he's agreeing with them. He's saying, you are correct that these things apply to you. Number two, it's not about tolerance. We're not tolerating your religion and your religious rights and your rights of conscience. It's a natural right given to you by God. Okay? And the third thing that he does is really fascinating, is he echoes Micah 4:4 that Paul read for us, where he says, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." This letter was so important that it's read annually in a public commemoration in Newport about religious liberty, and particularly Washington's take on this. And so 3 things. Number 1, yes, the broad liberties apply to you. 2, it's a natural right. It's not something that we're giving to you or tolerating of you. It's something that we're recognizing is something that God gives you. And thirdly, that we all ought to be able to dwell in safety and enjoy the blessings of freedom, okay? Under our own fig tree, as he echoes the words of Micah 4:4. Now, these are lofty ideals, right? But it's interesting. Who would have been absent from the discourse regarding these kind of ideas, religious liberty, liberty of conscience, and those kind of things in the late 18th century? Obviously, African slaves would have been considered in that group. All right, who else? Native Americans, okay? All right, and certainly women in regard to discrimination and sexism. And so, although we read these as lofty ideals, we need to understand that this was not a completed process, was it? This was not something that Washington understood perfectly. It was not something that he was perfectly consistent with. And so we need to understand that Washington, just like most of his generation, did not live up to the universal ideas that he's describing here. That everyone ought to be free to dwell under his fig tree in safety. That everybody has a natural right given by God. He owned slaves. Certainly slaves weren't a part of this discussion. Native Americans in some way weren't a part of this discussion. But the thing is that instead of being critical of these people, it's actually really amazing that they said what they said when they said it. That he said everybody ought to, as a natural right from God, have religious liberty, was an amazing statement in the late 18th century. And so, yes, there is a place for criticism. Yes, there is a place to say, hey, these ideals, they didn't live up to them in reality. A lot of these things were simply on paper. But the amazing thing is that they said them at all. And we'll talk about the ramifications of such for us even today. And so, although imperfect, it's even probably more impressive. Now think about how we have interreligious conflict and intolerance even today, even in the United States, which emphasize how these ideals were really groundbreaking and how important they were. I think it's highlighted by what presidential candidate and former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, said. You remember back a couple years ago, there was this big brouhaha about Muslims building a mosque or cultural center or whatever you want to call it near Ground Zero in New York. And this is what Gingrich said about that concept, or that idea of building that mosque there. He said, "There should be no mosque near Ground Zero in New York so long as there are no churches or synagogues in Saudi Arabia." Now think about that statement for a second. And I can't believe Gingrich said it. You know, he's a well-educated person, has a PhD in history, was a college professor, was a very smart person, well-educated, as I said. And I really can't believe he said it. Because think about what he's saying with that statement. He's saying our religious liberties, the dignity that we place on each individual and each individual's conscience in the United States based on our Constitution depends on what mullahs do in Saudi Arabia. Would Washington have agreed with that? Did he say that these rights of citizenship were based on what somebody else did somewhere else in the world? No, he said this was a guarantee provided for everybody, although he didn't perfectly apply it within the United States. He said it was a natural right, not tolerance, but a natural right given by God, and that everybody ought to feel safe and welcome in the United States, as long as, he says, you're a good citizen and giving your effectual support to this process. And so we can see that these ideas apply now. They're not 200-year-old ideas that we don't have to consider anymore. And so unlike Gingrich, Washington felt like the importance of Christianity specifically and religious liberty in general, and the religious foundation of the American Republic depended on religious freedom for everybody. You see, if we take religious freedom from one group, it can just as well be taken from us, can't it? And if we take it from one person or one group, then we don't have it, really. It might be on paper that we have it, but it can be taken from us at any moment. Now, did Washington take other steps to enhance such freedom? He did. He appointed John Murray, who's considered to be the founder of American Universalism, as chaplain in the Continental Army. Now think about how controversial that would have been at the time. Here is a sect of Christianity that's certainly not considered orthodox, and he appoints the founder of that sect or denomination as a chaplain in the Continental Army. In 1775, Washington banned soldiers in the Continental Army who were in Boston from participating in Pope's Day festivities. Pope's Day was a popular anti-Catholic festival in New England, and part of what they did was they would burn effigies of the Pope, and he banned soldiers from participating. And the Presbyterians complained after the Constitution was written that the Constitution had no reference to God and no reference to Jesus Christ in it. And they wrote to Washington complaining about it, and Washington's reply was that the new government would promote morality, and that true religion, as he said, would advance by support of this cause. And so his idea was that true religion had nothing to be afraid of in regard to granting religious liberty to everybody. And so as historians seek to reconstruct the past, we're often limited by the evidence that's available to us. And you'll have some that will say Washington was an evangelical Christian. You know, that we would be very comfortable with Washington's Christianity. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think there's any way that we could regard Washington as an evangelical Christian. He doesn't seem particularly interested in the idea of Jesus Christ and his death for our salvation. And so he's not a theologian. He's a soldier, he's a statesman, but he's not a theologian. But it was important what he was able to do and the leadership that he was able to provide, because what it did is it paved the way for the ratification of the First Amendment, which took effect a little over a year later after his visit to Newport on December 15th, 1791. And so the idea of a promise of full liberty of conscience, no matter what one's religious beliefs happen to be, is the legacy of this exchange of letters. And hopefully we can more fully say today than they could in the late 18th century that the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance.